Welcome friends to this course on understanding F-Studies drama. We are in week 2 and this is going to be lecture number 3. Today we are going to discuss the text Waiting for Godot in continuation to our previous class. In the last class we discussed the relationship between Vladimir and Estragon. We already know that Vladimir and Estragon are two tramps waiting for Godot who had promised them to come. They don't know when Godot will come or he would not come. While Vladimir and Estragon are waiting for Godot, there are two very interesting characters who happen to pass by. Their names are Pozzo and Lucky. Pozzo is the master. He is tied to Lucky by a rope. Pozzo in the play represents power, control and human vulnerability. In Act 1, he is domineering, arrogant figure, treating his servant Lucky cruelly and enjoying his authority. His speeches reflect his inflated sense of superiority, symbolizing the arbitrary nature of power. Although in Act 2, Pozzo becomes blind and dependent on his slave or servant named Lucky, showcasing the fragility of human existence and impermanence of authority. Lucky is Pozzo's servant. In fact, Lucky is ill-treated by his master Pozzo. He does not speak anything initially unless he is asked by Pozzo to think. Treatment of Lucky by Pozzo is almost animal-like. That shows how human existence can be dehumanized. Initially, he is portrayed as passive and submissive, enduring abuse from Pozzo, which highlights power dynamics. His chaotic monologue in the first act reflects the breakdown of language and absurdity of existence. In the second act, Lucky undergoes a transformation. He appears dumb and silent. However, as Pozzo becomes increasingly helpless, Lucky's silence can be seen as a subtle assertion of autonomy, marking a role reversal where he unintentionally assumes authority over Pozzo. In order to understand the complex relationship between Pozzo and Lucky, we have to focus on the philosophical idea of the Lord and bondsman suggested by a great philosopher Hegel. In Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel introduces the figure of the Lord and the bondsman to illustrate the relationship between independent and dependent self-consciousness arising from what he describes as a trial by death or the life and death struggle. Trial by death refers to two individuals confronting each other in life and death struggle for recognition. This moment arises because self-consciousness seeks to affirm its independence by negating the other. This struggle results in the trial by death, where each individual risks their life to prove their self-worth and independence. In fact, life and death struggle is a critical moment in the development of self-consciousness, where two individuals engage in a confrontation to assert their independence and gain recognition from the other. This struggle arises because self-consciousness is inherently relational. It requires recognition from another self-conscious being to affirm its own existence and freedom. Now, this idea is very interesting for us to reflect upon for a while. Hegel is suggesting that human life is marked by a series of struggles for recognition. This recognition is a byproduct of a consciousness encountering the other consciousness. For our benefit, we can call it self and the other. So, if we have two consciousness, the self and the other, which are struggling for recognition, the sense of self-worth or self-consciousness can emerge only when the other recognizes me as self. What I am trying to say is that if there are two individuals in one room locked, and if both of them fail to recognize each other, they will not be able to develop self-consciousness. Hegel is suggesting that it is essential for the self to recognize the other, and unless the other recognizes the self will not be able to have an idea of its own consciousness. Hegel elaborates this idea and he says, the truth of independent consciousness is accordingly the servile consciousness of the bondsman. This, it is true, appears at first outside of itself and not as the truth of self-consciousness. It is essential nature, but just as Lordship showed that its essential nature is the reverse of what it wants to be, so too servitude in its consummation will really turn into the opposite of what it immediately is. As a consciousness forced back into itself, it will withdraw into itself and be transformed into a truly independent consciousness. Therefore, we can understand that Hegel is talking about two kinds of consciousness: master consciousness and slave consciousness. Master consciousness refers to the consciousness of the master, in which the master appears to be independent, powerful, sovereign, autonomous, with full absolute subjectivity. However, the fact of the matter is that the master is dependent upon the slave to be recognized as the master. If the slave or the servant will fail to recognize the master as master, the master will not have his or her own self-worth as master. So, Hegel is suggesting that master's independence is illusory because it relies on the bondsman to provide recognition, perform labor and satisfy the master's need. Thus, according to Hegel, the true foundation of self-consciousness is not in the supposed independence of the master, but in the experience and labor of the bondsman. Similarly, servitude over time transforms into the opposite of what it appears to be. Though the bondsman initially seems powerless and dependent, through the process of labor and self-reflection, the bondsman gains self-consciousness and autonomy. Now, what Hegel is suggesting? Hegel is simply suggesting that human self-consciousness is born out of a struggle with the other self-consciousness. So, there are two selves, and these two selves are conflicting with each other after their initial encounter. Each self wants to dominate the other self, and therefore each self wants to project itself as subject and the other self as an object. However, the ultimate result is going to be a hierarchical construction of self-consciousness in which one self is going to be victorious, therefore the master, and the other self is going to accept its defeat and therefore accept servitude. So, Hegel's idea is that the master-slave dialectic is fundamental to human experience and human consciousness. Now, this idea has been elaborated profoundly in the play Waiting for Godot. In the play, we have Pozzo, the master, and we have Lucky, the slave. Pozzo thinks that he is the master. In fact, Pozzo always commands Lucky for whip, for basket, for coat, for stool, so on and so forth. And Lucky follows the order of Pozzo without any objection. In fact, initially, Lucky does not speak a single word. In fact, Lucky dances when Pozzo asks him to dance. Lucky thinks when Pozzo asks him to think. So we can see that Lucky has accepted his servitude and therefore he happens to be a slave as far as this master-slave dialectic is concerned. But that is the case initially. Later, Lucky becomes more powerful, although accidentally. How? In the second act of the play, Pojo becomes blind, Pojo becomes helpless, although Lucky is still serving Pojo, he has not left Pojo, yet he has gained greater control and authority over Pojo. And therefore, what Hegel has suggested, which we have just discussed, that in the master-slave dialectics, there is role reversal. Master who considers himself to be a master does not remain a master. In fact, his masterhood or his sense of self-worth becomes dependent upon his slave. And slave, by virtue of the work that he performs, and because now the master is dependent upon that slave, becomes in some way master of the master. So, like in Hegel's dialectic, the master depends on slave for recognition, the slave gains self-consciousness through labor. And therefore, similarly in Waiting for Godot, like Hegel's master, Pojo is dependent on Lucky for his power, and his sense of mastery is undermined when he becomes blind, symbolizing his ultimate reliance on Lucky. The master-slave relationship in Waiting for Godot mirrors the existential predicament of human beings. Pojo and Lucky's roles emphasize not just power dynamics, but the futility of dominance and submission in a world devoid of meaning, where both master and slave are bound to each other and to the absurdity of their existence. Now we need to discuss how the slave has been made to think in the play Waiting for Godot by his master Pojo. In the play, we have Lucky's monologue. Lucky's monologue is mostly a nonsensical babbling. It is a continuous run-on of unpunctuated stupid words and phrases, and therefore it becomes very difficult to understand the nonsense that Lucky is speaking about in the play. However, Lucky's nonsensical speech is the crux of the play. Beckett himself has indicated that to understand the meaning of the play, Lucky's nonsensical monologue can be a very important source. So, briefly, we would discuss Lucky's monologue. I have already given in the PowerPoint the text, which we'll read briefly and thereafter discuss. Lucky's monologue begins with, given the existence as uttered forth in the public works of Puncher and Watman of a personal God, qua qua qua, with white beard, qua qua qua, outside time without extension, who form the heights of divine apatheia, divine athembia, divine aphasia, loves us dearly, with some exceptions for reason unknown, but time will tell, and suffers like divine Miranda, with those who for reasons unknown, but time will tell, are plunged in torment, plunged in fire, whose fire flames, if that continues, and who can doubt it will fire the permanent, that is to say, blast hell to heaven, so blue, still and calm, so calm with a calm which, even though intermittent, is better than nothing. Now, if we look at these words written in English, we cannot make any meaning out of it. Why? Because this monologue by Lucky is supposed to be nonsensical, absurd, to symbolize the futility of words to express meaning, or the futility of language to communicate our expressions or our emotions, thoughts and feelings. Now, first part, as I have divided Lucky's speech into three parts, where Lucky discusses three important aspects of the play, deals with Lucky's meditation upon the existence of God, whether God exists or not. That is a philosophical question that Lucky is discussing. Now, Lucky says, given the existence of God, imagine for a while that there is God. Now, if there is a God, what kind of God that God is? Whether that God is kind God, benevolent God, or that God is malevolent God, cruel God, or that God is indifferent God? Now, Lucky says, given the existence as uttered forth, given that we believe that God exists. Now, what kind of God it is? So he says, with white beard, and it is a personal God. Now, personal God, God can be personal, God can be impersonal. God can have form, God can have a formlessness. Now, Lucky's God initially is personal God. He has a form, he has a swaroop. What that form is? That God has a white beard. Alright? And then there is another God or idea of another God which Lucky proposes. And that God is impersonal God. God that is outside time without extension. So there are two forms of gods or God being discussed here. The personal God or impersonal God. Indian correspondence can refer to Sagun God and Nirgun God. God with a form, or Nirgun God like Binu Pag Chalay, Sunay Binu Kana, Kare Binu Karm, Karai Vidinana. So God exists, whether that God is of God with a form or God without a form. God with a white beard or God outside time and space. Now what that God is? Lucky says that God has three attributes. What are these three attributes? He says he has divine apatheia, divine athambia, and divine aphasia. Divine apatheia refers to apathy of God. Apathy here implies God has no mercy for mankind. Neither God is kind nor God is cruel. You see, this play was written in the backdrop of World War II. In World War II, millions of human beings were killed. If there was a God, and if that God was kind and benevolent, what that God was doing? So Beckett's hypothesis through Lucky is that God suffers from apatheia. He has no pathos for the world. He has no mercy for the world. And why it is so? Because that God has another attribute. He suffers from divine athambia. Athambia here refers to imperturbability. It refers to God's indifference, that the God that exists is indifferent to man and is indifferent to mankind. If human beings are suffering, God is not bothered that human beings are suffering. So God has divine apatheia, divine athambia, and also divine aphasia. God will not speak, God will not intervene, because that God has become dumb, like Lucky would become dumb in the second act of the play. So you have to understand, Beckett through Lucky is meditating upon the nature of existence and also upon the idea of God. Now Beckett is also suggesting, and you must have marked, that there are some words whose meanings you may not be able to understand. They do not appear to be words written in English. These words are qua qua qua, qua qua qua, and the word qua qua qua, qua 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 is between personal God, white beard, outside time. Now qua qua qua, of course, it has allusions to the French word caca, which means excrement or feces. But it also suggests that it's a meaningless sound. So the entire debate about the existence of God or non-existence of God appears to be qua qua qua, qua qua qua, qua qua qua, meaningless, absurd. Now, there is another quality that this God has. Although God has divine apatheia, divine athambia, and divine aphasia, yet Lucky says that God loves us dearly with some exceptions. You can see the lines here. Loves us dearly with some exceptions. And why these exceptions? For reasons unknown. Why God loves someone, why God does not love someone, why God loves some parts of mankind, why does not He love some other parts of mankind. So that reason is unknown, but that God loves us dearly, despite divine apatheia, divine athembia and divine aphasia. But despite the existence of God, what is the fate of human beings? Human beings are plunged in torment. Human beings are plunged in fire and they are suffering. So, even if there is God, that God is indifferent, and because of indifference of God, human beings are suffering. This is what Lucky is proposing in first part of the speech, which is not even a full sentence. It is half a sentence. There is no full stop, there is no comma, you just have words. You can call it gibberish, you can call it nonsense, but there is some sense you can make out of this, and this is what we make out of the first part of Lucky's speech. Now we move to the second part of Lucky's speech. Second part of Lucky's speech focuses on man's existence. So first part was about God, second part is about man. What is man? What is the purpose of human existence? And I'll read the passage for you and then we'll discuss. But not so fast, and considering what is more, that as a result of the labors left unfinished, crowned by the Academy of Anthropometry, of essay in poesy, of Testue and Conrad, it is established beyond all doubt, all other doubt, than that which clings to the labors of men, that as a result of the labors unfinished of Testue and Conrad, it is established as hereinafter, but not so fast, for reasons unknown, that as a result of public works of Puncher and Watman, it is established beyond all doubt that in view of the labors of Fatov and Belcher, left unfinished for reasons unknown of Testue and Conrad, left unfinished, it is established what many deny, that man in poesy of Testue and Conrad, that man in essay, that man in short, that man in brief, in spite of the strides of alimentation and defecation, is seen to west and pine, west and pine. Now, you have to observe or mark certain words. This part of Lucky's speech, as I already told you, focuses on man's existence. And there are two words that you need to notice: essay and posse. Essay refers to be, and posse refers to be able to or becoming. So basically, the entire existentialist debate of being and becoming is being summarized by Beckett in these lines. And Beckett is suggesting that human life is about alimentation and defecation. Alimentation refers to nourishment and defecation refers to excrement. Human beings eat and then they excrete. An entire human life is a journey of eating and excreting. And how the entire journey in between is passed? It is passed between two words: west and pine, west and pine. First we desire, then our desires are fulfilled. When our desires are fulfilled, we don't desire what we desired, we start desiring something new. So what we had desired, which was important for us, those desires become meaningless, they become futile. Suppose today you desire to become a teacher. When you become a teacher, you would not be contented to remain a teacher. So your desire to be a teacher will be a waste. So entire human life is a series of desire and wasting of that desire. And Beckett, through Lucky, is simply saying that although human beings desire and their desires are wasted, what they have to understand? They have to understand that man's life on this earth is brief, on this earth is short. And unless human beings understand that there is a vast eternity, there is eternal time, and the lifespan of a human being on this earth is minuscule, is very small, and therefore all human beings have to acknowledge or understand their minusculeness or their smallness, and also the briefness of their lives. Now, what if our lives are brief? What if we don't have a long life? What should we do? Like Vladimir and Stragon are waiting for their death to come, or waiting for Godot to come. What should they do while they are living? Now, if you look at the next slide, you will find out that there are certain words which are very important. So, what if human life is short? What if human life is brief? The purpose of a man in this life is to continue, is to go on and on and on and on, and the word on becomes very important. The word I resume becomes very important. And you would remember when we discussed the myth of Sisyphus, the word I resume was also there, because Sisyphus would always resume his journey of rolling the rock to the top of the mountain every day, fully knowing that life is meaningless and futile. And therefore, to resume their journey, how human beings pass their time? Human beings create culture. Lucky says, and I quote, "In spite of the strides of physical culture, the practice of sports such as tennis, football, running, cycling, swimming, flying, floating, riding, gliding, canoeing, camogie, skating, tennis of all kinds, dying, flying, sports of all sorts, autumn, summer, winter, tennis of all kinds, hockey of all sorts, penicillin. In a word, I resume concurrently, simultaneously, for reasons unknown, to shrink and dwindle. In spite of the tennis, I resume flying, gliding, golf over 9 and 18 holes, tennis of all sorts, in a word, for reasons unknown, in Feckham, Peckham, Fulham, Calpham. Namely, so concurrently, simultaneously, what is more, for reasons unknown, but time will tell, to shrink and dwindle. I resume Fulham, Clapham, in a word, the dead lost per caput, since the death of Bishop Berkeley being to the tune of 1 inch 4 ounce per caput, approximately, by and large, more or less, to the nearest decimal, good measure, round figure, stark naked, in the stocking feet, in Connemara, in a word, for regions unknown, no matter what matter, the facts are there." Now, all these words are meaningless words. They are just words, and there are some words from sports, like you have tennis. Now, what tennis is? Tennis is the movement of, it's a forward movement, backward movement, forward movement, backward movement. That's how our life oscillates. So, we play tennis. We may do cycling. Cycling is another important metaphor. If you have seen the wheels of the cycle, you have the outer rim and then you have axle. Now try to imagine the outer wheel is cosmos, or the outer wheel is outer rim is the wheel of life, and what is the inner axle? That is an individual. So cycling is a very important metaphor. So human beings, they indulge in all kinds of pleasures like running, cycling, swimming, playing tennis, playing football, flying, floating, riding, gliding. They do all kinds of things. Then in between you have one word, very important word, dying. Alright. So like human beings fly, like human beings play, like human beings run, like human beings do cycling, what do? They also die. So dying is not very important, dying is not very significant. Dying is like any other activity. Like you have been brushing your teeth, that is an activity. Simply you died, that is another activity. So that's what Beckett is suggesting. Life and death are not as significant as we consider them to be. Why? Because man's journey on this earth is journey towards shrinking and dwindling. Beckett is saying man shrinks and man dwindles, despite this knowledge that all of us have to shrink, all of us have to dwindle, all of us will grow old and eventually die. We all have to resume our struggle like Sisyphus does, and therefore all of us have to be Sisyphean and absurdist in the Sisyphean sense. Now, if we resume our journey, if we continue struggling, if we continue doing what we are doing, will that lead us to anything meaningful? Is our labor going to be useful or it is going to be futile? Beckett's philosophy through Lucky is suggesting that all human labors are going to be lost. That's why I have titled this part of the Lucky's speech as Labor Lost. Lucky says, and considering what is much more grave, that in the light of the labors lost of Steenweg and Petermann, it appears what is much more grave, that in the light of the labors lost of Steenweg and Petermann, that in the plains, in the mountains, by the seas, by the rivers, running water, running fire, the air is the same, and the earth, namely the air, then the earth in the great cold, the great dark, the air and the earth abode of stones, in the great cold, alas, alas, in the year of their Lord 600 and something, the air, the earth, the sea, the earth abode of stones, in the great, the deep, the great cold on and sea, on land and in the air. Now Lucky is suggesting that despite human efforts, despite human desire, all human labors are going to be lost. Because this world in which we are living, it is an indifferent place. Cosmos is not bothered whether I have done something meaningful or meaningless. The word that Beckett has used comes from Camus, and that word is stone. Camus calls earth abode of stones, and then it will remind you of the rock of Sisyphus. Rock that Sisyphus was rolling to the top of the mountain, fully knowing that the world is indifferent to his efforts, and also the task in itself has no meaning. Now in third part of Lucky's speech, Lucky focuses on the inevitable aspect of human journey, that is death. Lucky says, I resume for reasons unknown in spite of the tennis, the facts are there, but time will tell. I resume, alas, alas, on, in short, in fine, on, abode of stones, who can doubt it? I resume, but not so fast. I resume the skull to shrink and vest, and concurrently, simultaneously, what is more for reasons unknown, in spite of the tennis, on, the beard, the flames, the tears, the stones, so blue, so calm, alas, alas, on, the skull in Connemara, in spite of the tennis, the labors abundant, left unfinished, graver still, abode of stones in a world. I resume, alas, alas, abundant, unfinished, the skull in Connemara, in spite of the tennis, the skull, alas, the stones, Conrad, tennis, the stones so calm, Conrad, unfinished. Now, despite the fact that we resume, despite the fact that we go on and on, ultimately our life is going to remain unfinished. Tasks that we consider important, that we have decided to complete, will never be complete. Journey of human life will always remain unfinished. And it would remain unfinished with the arrival of death. In spite of tennis that you play, in spite of advancements in medical science, Beckett refers to the word penicillin, despite the entire progress that mankind has made, mankind has not been successful in evading or avoiding death. Death cannot be avoided. That is a fact of life which Beckett wants us to understand. Beckett wants to understand that at the end, what will be left? The skull, the skull, the skull, the skull. So, what will remain on this earth? The skull. What will happen to our labors? All labors will be abundant. What will happen to life? Life would be left unfinished. And Lucky's speech, which is not even a full sentence. The entire speech which we have read so far is not even one sentence. It is half a sentence. So Lucky's sentence remains incomplete. It remains unfinished. Similarly, our own lives would also remain unfinished. And that's what Beckett wants us to understand. And therefore, Beckett advises us, not in the strict sense of advice, to reflect upon the nature of human existence, the nature of human life, to understand the absurdity of life, the meaninglessness of life, and through Lucky, he instructs us to go on and on and on, fully knowing that our life will remain incomplete, unfinished. Friends, today we try to discuss relationship between Pozo and Lucky through philosophical frameworks of Hegel, and also the idea of absurdity discussed by Beckett through Lucky and his monologue. We'll discuss remaining aspects of the play in our next class. Thank you.